The door was unlocked. She always locked that door. Ivy Calloway stood frozen in the hallway, staring at the half-inch gap of darkness where the frame met the latch. And every instinct she owned screamed the same word. Run! She didn't run. She pushed the door open instead, and found him sitting in her own armchair, waiting for her in the dark. 90 seconds later, she was on the floor, her phone clutched to her chest, dialing the only number she had ever trusted to save a stranger's life. 3 sentences, an address, a weapon, a scream, then a fist, and the world went white, and the call kept ringing into the dark long after she could no longer speak into it. What answered was not a dispatcher. It was not a patrol car, not a badge, not the police at all. It was a voice that did not belong to this century, calm and cold and absolutely certain, and it made her one single promise before the line went silent. Stay on the line. I am already coming. She did not know, in that moment, that the man who said those words had not walked the earth as an ordinary man in over 400 years. She did not know that the storm outside had knocked her call sideways into a phone line that had not rung in over a decade. A private line belonging to no one the city's own records could explain. She only knew that something was coming for her, faster than any ambulance, faster than any patrol car, and that whatever it was, it had already sworn, in a voice that made the air itself go cold, that it would not be too late. 3 hours earlier, none of this had seemed possible. Ivy Calloway had spent 4 years of her life sitting inside a headset, calming down strangers in the worst 30 seconds of their lives. She was the one who told a sobbing teenager how to perform chest compressions on her own father. She was the one who talked a man off an overpass ledge for 40 minutes without ever raising her voice. She had a gift, the kind that could not be taught in a 6-week training academy. A low, level, unshakable calm that made panicking people believe, if only for a moment, that everything might actually be fine. What none of her co-workers knew was that the calm voice she gave to every terrified caller was a performance she had learned by necessity. For 2 years, she had lived with a man who required her to sound steady while afraid every single day. His name was Marcus Doyle, a Chicago police detective, magnetic to his colleagues, a monster behind closed doors. He tracked her phone. He turned compliments into threats. His hands, trained and certified to protect the public, had left bruises she hid under long sleeves even in July, because she worked in a building full of people trained to notice exactly that kind of thing. She had left him 4 months ago. 2 attempts, 1 small mountain of courage, 2 suitcases packed while he worked a night shift. A modest 1-bedroom apartment on the far side of the city. Not glamorous. Hers. He had not taken it well. The calls first. Then the parked car she pretended not to notice. Then flowers on her doorstep, with notes that read like apologies and felt like warnings. She had filed a report with an officer outside his precinct, specifically so it would not vanish the way every prior complaint against him always had. The order of protection sat laminated in her nightstand drawer, 3 weeks old. And Ivy had learned, over a career spent answering calls from women just like herself, exactly how little that piece of paper meant the moment a man decided it meant nothing. It was a Thursday night in late October, when the storm rolled in off the lake, turning the city's amber streetlights into smeared halos behind sheets of rain. Ivy had worked a double, 16 hours in the chair, her voice gone hoarse from talking a fentanyl overdose's roommate through rescue breathing while paramedics fought gridlock traffic 3 miles away. She clocked out at 11, exhausted in the particular bone-deep way that came from holding other people's emergencies inside her own chest for an entire shift, and drove home through the rain, grateful for nothing more complicated than the promise of her own bed. She noticed, the moment she pulled into the small gravel lot behind her building, that the security light over the back entrance was out. It had been working the week before. She sat in her car for a long moment, engine ticking as it cooled, rain drumming on the roof, telling herself it was nothing, telling herself that lights burned out, that this was simply the mundane entropy of an old building with a landlord who took 3 weeks to answer a maintenance request. She had talked hundreds of frightened callers through the exact same argument with themselves, the quiet negotiation between instinct and reason, and she recognized, with a kind of grim irony, that she was doing it now to herself. She went inside anyway. She always went inside anyway. That was the terrible math of living alone as a woman who had already survived one man's rage. Eventually, exhaustion outvoted caution every single night, because you could not live your whole life standing in a parking lot afraid of your own doorway. The stairwell smelled like wet concrete and old paint. Her apartment was on the 3rd floor, at the end of a corridor, lit by a single flickering fluorescent tube that buzzed like a trapped insect. She had her keys threaded between her fingers, an old habit from a self-defense class she had taken years before Marcus, before any of it, and she told herself that was simply prudence, not fear. She stopped at the top of the stairs, one hand still on the rail, and stared at the gap. She stood in the hallway, staring at the brass knob, at that same half-inch gap of darkness she already knew was coming, and every ounce of professional calm she had spent 16 hours performing for strangers evaporated in an instant. She knew, with the absolute certainty of a woman who had once memorized every sound this man's footsteps made, that she had locked this door that morning. She always locked this door. It was the single non-negotiable ritual of her new life, the small physical proof that she controlled the threshold of her own home. She should have run. Every piece of her training, every call she had ever taken, every case study from the crisis intervention seminars she had sat through, told her to turn around, walk quietly back down the stairs, get in her car, and call for help from somewhere safe. Instead, some deeper, more foolish part of her, the part that still could not quite believe 2 years of her life, had ended with a piece of laminated paper in a drawer, pushed the door open. The apartment was dark, except for the pale wash of streetlight bleeding through the blinds, and Marcus Doyle was sitting in her armchair, in the dark, waiting for her. The way a spider waits at the center of a web, it did not need to move to catch anything. "You changed the locks," he said, and his voice was mild, almost conversational, the voice he used on suspects right before he decided they were lying to him. "Took me a while to get past that. You always did think a little too highly of your own security." Ivy's hand found the light switch out of pure reflex. The overhead bulb flared on, and she saw him clearly then. Saw the state of him, unshaven, eyes rimmed red, a bottle of whiskey sitting open on her coffee table beside his service weapon, which he had placed there with the careful, deliberate showmanship of a man who wanted her to see it. He was not in uniform. He was off-duty, which meant, in the particular grammar of Marcus Doyle's violence, that there would be no body camera, no radio traffic, no dispatch log with his badge number attached to this address. He had planned that part carefully. He planned everything carefully. It was, Ivy had come to understand over 2 years, the thing that made him so much more dangerous than an ordinary angry man. He thought like a predator with a badge, which meant he had spent his entire career learning exactly how the system worked and exactly how to make sure it never worked against him. "Marcus, you need to leave," Ivy said. And she was proud, in some small, distant corner of her mind, that her voice did not shake, that 4 years of dispatcher training held even now, even here, even with her own heart slamming against her ribs like something trying to escape. "There's a protective order. You are not supposed to be within 1,000 feet of this apartment. I know exactly what the order says." Marcus rose from the chair, unhurried, and the whiskey had done nothing to slow him, only stripped away whatever thin restraint had ever existed underneath the charming exterior he wore for the rest of the world. "I wrote up guys for violating orders just like it. You know what I always thought? Every single time. I thought, that poor woman doesn't know how useless that piece of paper actually is until it's too late. Please." The word left her before she could stop it, and she hated herself for it instantly. Hated the way it sounded exactly like every caller she had ever coached through a home invasion. Hated that after everything, after all her training, after all her careful rebuilding of a life without him, she was still standing in her own doorway begging. "I'm not here to hurt you," Marcus said, which was, Ivy knew, from bitter experience, the sentence he always said in the 60 seconds directly before he hurt her. "I just want you to understand something. You don't get to disappear on me, Ivy. You don't get to file paperwork and think that erases 2 years. I built you. Do you understand that? Every good thing about you. That calm little voice you use on the phones. I taught you that. I taught you how to survive fear because I was your fear, and you owe me for that." He crossed the room faster than she expected, faster than the whiskey should have allowed, and his hand closed around her wrist with the same crushing, practiced pressure she remembered from 100 nights she had spent trying to forget. Ivy twisted, driving her keys, still threaded between her fingers, into the side of his hand, and he snarled, more surprised than hurt, and shoved her backward into the small kitchen counter hard enough to knock the wind from her lungs. Her phone skittered from her jacket pocket across the tile floor. She scrambled for it on instinct alone, some deep animal part of her brain screaming the only protocol it had ever been trained to trust, and her thumb found the emergency call icon before Marcus's hand closed around her ankle and dragged her back across the floor. The phone still clutched against her chest, the line already ringing. "Give me that," Marcus said, and his voice had lost every trace of its earlier mildness, gone entirely to something raw and animal. He wrenched the phone from her grip, and in the struggle, the call connected, the small, tinny sound of a distant operator's voice crackling out of the speaker, even as Marcus raised the phone over his head to smash it against the counter. Ivy did the only thing she could think to do. She screamed a location into the open line. 3 sentences delivered with the terrified, rapid clarity of every caller she had ever coached. An address, an apartment number, the words, "He has a gun," before Marcus's fist connected with the side of her head, and the world tilted sideways into a ringing, white-edged silence. The phone hit the floor and did not break. It bounced once, skittered under the edge of the refrigerator, and lay there, screen glowing, the call still connected, transmitting nothing now but the muffled sounds of a struggle and a man's furious voice, and, underneath it all, a woman's ragged breathing. What Ivy Calloway did not know, could not have known, was that the storm rolling in off Lake Michigan that night had done more than douse the city in rain. It had, 3 hours earlier, snapped a transmission line feeding one of the primary routing towers for the emergency communications grid on the city's near north side, the exact tower that handled call traffic for her block. The backup systems, redundant and expensive and rarely tested under real conditions, had rerouted automatically, the way they were designed to, shunting a fraction of a percent of the night's call volume through an auxiliary relay that fed through a chain of infrastructure so old and so obscure that most of the technicians who maintained the modern network did not know it still existed, into a private line that had been quietly, deliberately embedded into the city's telecommunications backbone, the better part of a century earlier, by a man with more money and more patience than anyone had ever thought to question. It was not supposed to be possible for a 911 call to route anywhere except a public safety answering point, staffed by trained municipal dispatchers. It was not supposed to be possible for a private residential line, unlisted, unregistered, belonging to no visible entity, to receive emergency traffic at all. And yet, in a penthouse 30 stories above the rain-lashed streets of the Gold Coast, in a room lined with dark wood and old books, and a single bank of glass that looked out over the storm-tossed lake, like the prow of some great ship, a phone that almost never rang. Damien Ashworth set down the crystal glass of blood wine. He had been turning absently in his fingers and looked at the antique telephone sitting on the mahogany desk with an expression of genuine, ancient surprise. He had not heard that particular ring in 11 years. The line had been installed in 1931, back when Damien had still believed in the naive optimism of a vampire who had only recently claimed sovereignty over a fractured and violent city, that a direct channel into the emergency grid might allow him to intervene in the worst of human suffering before it curdled into something that would draw the attention of his own kind, before some desperate mortal's final moments became an opportunity for a lesser predator to feed. He had used the line perhaps a dozen times across 9 decades, always for calls of a particular character, calls that carried within them the specific, unmistakable resonance of someone who was about to be lost forever. If help did not arrive in the space of minutes rather than the 12 or 15, it typically took an overworked city police department to answer a routine domestic disturbance call. He had, over the decades, come to think of the line as a relic, a piece of his own history. He had never quite found the will to disconnect, a monument to the version of himself who had still believed he could save every ruined thing he touched. He answered it on the second ring. What came through the line was not a voice speaking to him. It was a voice speaking past him, urgent and fractured, delivering an address in a rapid staccato rhythm that told him, before he had processed a single word of the content, that the woman on the other end of this call was a professional, someone trained to transmit critical information under conditions of extreme duress. He heard the address. He heard the words, "He has a gun." He heard, an instant later, the specific, sickening sound of a fist connecting with flesh, and then the muffled scrape of a phone hitting tile, and then, underneath the static, a man's voice, low and furious, and a woman's voice, thin and afraid, trying and failing to sound calm. Damien Ashworth had lived for 460 years. He had watched the plague empty entire cities. He had stood on battlefields where the mud ran red for a quarter-mile in every direction. He had, in the earliest and most brutal centuries of his existence, done things he no longer allowed himself to remember in detail, things that had taught him, at terrible cost, the exact weight and texture of unnecessary suffering, and the specific, quiet fury it was possible for an immortal creature to feel on behalf of someone he had never met. He was out of the chair before the second sentence of struggle finished playing through the receiver. He did not call for his car. He did not summon the small, discreet staff who managed the penthouse and the tower beneath it and the various holdings that made Damien Ashworth, to the human world, nothing more exotic than a reclusive real estate investor who owned an improbable amount of Chicago's skyline. He went to the window instead, threw the heavy glass pane open against the shrieking wind of the storm, and stepped out into 300 feet of empty October air, with the calm, unhurried certainty of a man stepping off a curb. The fall did not concern him. Very little concerned him anymore, after 4 centuries, except the particular sound of a woman's voice trying to hide her own fear, and the knowledge, absolute and immediate, that somewhere across this drowned and glittering city, a clock had already started counting down toward an ending he had no intention of allowing. He did not fly. Not exactly. Not in the crude, cinematic sense mortals imagined when they thought of his kind. What he did was closer to falling with intention. A controlled, impossibly fast descent, aided by strength and reflexes that no human engineering could replicate, his coat snapping like a sail behind him as he dropped through the rain, tracking the pulse of the storm and the pull of a voice he had heard for perhaps 4 seconds and would have known again anywhere in the world. He landed in the alley behind Ivy's building with a controlled impact that cracked the wet asphalt beneath his shoes and did not so much as wrinkle his suit. He was through the back door before the echo of the impact had finished rolling down the block, up 3 flights of stairs in the time it would have taken a human sprinter to clear one, and standing in the hallway outside apartment 3C, with his hand already closing around the frame of a door that had been left, in Marcus Doyle's careless fury, unlatched behind him. Inside, Marcus Doyle had Ivy pinned against the kitchen counter, one hand fisted in her hair, forcing her head back, his other hand raised, and he was in the middle of the specific, practiced cruelty of a sentence designed to make her believe this was somehow her fault, when the temperature in the room dropped so suddenly and so completely that his breath fogged in front of his face. "Let go of her," Damien said, and his voice was quiet, almost gentle, the way the sea is quiet, in the moment directly before it swallows a ship whole. Marcus spun, his training asserting itself even through the whiskey and the rage, his free hand already reaching for the service weapon he had left on the coffee table across the room. He got perhaps 1.5 feet toward it before he found himself, with no clear memory of having moved at all, pinned against the far wall of Ivy's living room, his feet 6 inches off the floor, a pale hand wrapped with impossible gentleness and impossible strength around his throat. "You're going to want to be very still," Damien said. And Ivy, sliding down the front of her own kitchen cabinets to the floor, her vision still swimming from the blow to her head, looked up at the man, at the thing, holding her ex-boyfriend against the wall like he weighed nothing at all, and felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, the strange and disorienting sensation of being, without question, entirely safe. Marcus clawed at the hand around his throat, his police training utterly useless against a grip that did not budge no matter how he twisted, no matter how he drove his knuckles into a wrist that felt, under his fists, like striking stone wrapped in cool skin. His eyes bulged, panic finally breaking through the whiskey and the rage in equal measure, and he managed, in a strangled whisper, to force out the only weapon he had left. "I'm a police officer," he gasped. "You put your hands on me again. You're looking at federal charges, assaulting an officer. You have no idea who you're—" "I know exactly who you are." Damien's voice had not risen at all, had not gained a single degree of heat, and somehow that stillness was more frightening than any shout could have been. "You are Marcus Doyle, badge number 4, 1726. 11 prior complaints filed against you by 5 different women. Every single one of them closed without action because the officers reviewing them owed you favors, or feared you, or simply did not care enough to look past the uniform. You broke this woman's trust in every system that was supposed to protect her, and then you broke into her home to finish the job. Am I missing anything, Detective?" Marcus went very still. The particular stillness of a man realizing, for the first time in his adult life, that he had walked into a situation his badge could not talk him out of. "How do you—" "I make it my business to know things about this city," Damien said. "Every ugly, hidden thing this city tries to bury under permits and paperwork and closed case files eventually finds its way to me. That is rather the point of being what I am." Ivy, still on the floor, one hand braced against the cool tile, watched the stranger's face in profile and felt something shift in her understanding of the room. Some deep instinctual recalibration that told her, long before her conscious mind caught up, that the man holding Marcus against the wall was not, in any meaningful sense, a man at all. His stillness was wrong in a way she could not immediately name. Nothing about him moved unless he intended it to move. No breath fogging unnecessarily in the cold he had brought into the room with him. No restless shifting of weight. No blinking. He held Marcus a full foot off the ground, with one arm extended, as effortlessly as a man might hold a coat on a hanger. And his eyes, when he finally turned them toward her, were not quite the color she had first assumed. They had been, a moment ago, a deep and ordinary brown. Now, catching the light from the single bulb overhead, they carried a faint, unmistakable wash of red at their edges, like ink bleeding slowly through water. "Are you hurt?" he asked her. And it was not really a question, more an assessment, his gaze moving over her with a clinical thoroughness that catalogued the darkening bruise already rising along her cheekbone, the way she cradled her wrist against her chest, the faint tremor in her hands that 4 years of professional composure could not quite suppress. "I'm okay," Ivy said, which was, she realized even as she said it, the same reflexive lie every one of her own callers told her in the first 60 seconds of an emergency. The same lie she spent every shift gently working past to get to the actual truth of a person's condition. "I'm okay," she said again, and heard, distantly, how little conviction the words carried. "You are not okay," Damien said, not unkindly, But you will be. He turned his attention back to Marcus, and something in his expression sharpened. The faint patience he had shown Ivy replaced by a colder, older calculation. As for you, detective, I find myself faced with a choice. I could simply end this, here, tonight, and no one in this city would ever find enough of you to file a report. It would be, I promise you, remarkably easy. I have done considerably less thinking about considerably better men. Marcus made a thin, involuntary sound, something between a whimper and a plea, and Ivy, even through the fog of pain and adrenaline, felt a strange twist of vindication low in her chest. 4 years of practiced calm, briefly giving way to something rawer and more honest. But, Damien continued, I find that the world is generally better served by consequences that last longer than a single convenient night. You are going to leave this apartment, Detective Doyle, and you are never going to come near this woman again. Not at her home, not at her place of work, not within 100 miles of any place she happens to be standing. If you violate that boundary, even once, even by accident, I promise you that the next conversation we have will not end with you walking out of the room under your own power. You can't threaten a cop, Marcus managed, though the bravado in his voice had curdled into something closer to begging. I'll have you arrested. I'll have you... You will do nothing, Damien said. And something changed in the room, a pressure building in the air that made Ivy's ears pop, that made the light bulb overhead flicker and dim. Because you already know, somewhere in whatever remains of your conscience, precisely what you are, and precisely what would happen to your career, your pension, your freedom, the moment I decide to walk into the office of every superior officer you have ever answered to and hand them 11 years of evidence I have already collected on your conduct. I am not threatening you with violence, detective, though I promise you I am fully capable of it. I am promising you an ending far worse for a man like yourself. I am promising you exposure. He set Marcus down, slowly, deliberately, the way a man might set down something he found faintly distasteful, and Marcus staggered, catching himself against the wall, staring at Damien with the particular wide-eyed horror of a predator, realizing, for the first time in his life, that he had wandered into the territory of something further up the chain than himself. Leave, Damien said. And the single word carried enough weight behind it that Marcus was moving toward the door before his own conscious mind had finished processing the command, snatching his weapon from the coffee table with shaking hands, casting one final, unreadable look back at Ivy. And then he was gone, his footsteps retreating unevenly down the stairwell, the outer door banging once against the wind before the storm swallowed the sound of him entirely. The silence that followed felt enormous. Damien crossed the room and knelt in front of Ivy with a slow, deliberate care, as though he understood, on some deep instinctual level, exactly how much of a threat his own sudden proximity might feel like to a woman who had just watched him lift a grown man off the ground with one hand. He did not reach for her. He simply knelt, close enough to speak quietly, far enough to leave her room, and waited. You called for help, he said, and it reached me instead of the police. I imagine that is a great deal to process on top of everything else this night has already asked of you. Ivy stared at him. Up close, in the better light, she could see him clearly for the first time, the sharp architecture of his face, cheekbones that looked carved rather than grown, dark hair pushed back from his forehead by the rain and the wind of whatever impossible method had brought him here, a mouth that seemed built for a kind of formality the modern world had mostly abandoned. He wore a suit that looked tailored to a precision she associated with men on magazine covers, not men kneeling on the floor of a rundown one-bedroom apartment at midnight. And his eyes, up close, had settled back into that deep, ordinary brown, no trace remaining of the red she had seen a moment before. Except that she knew, with absolute certainty, that she had not imagined it. "What are you?" she asked, and her dispatcher's voice, the professional calm she had spent years perfecting, cracked audibly on the final word. "My name is Damien Ashworth," he said, as though that alone might answer the question. And then, seeing that it plainly had not, he allowed something almost like a rueful smile to touch the corner of his mouth. "I am a great many complicated things, Miss Calloway, most of which will take considerably longer to explain than the state you are currently in allows for. For tonight, I would ask you to accept a simpler answer. I am the thing that answered when the world failed to." "How do you know my name?" "Your address came through with the call. The rest, I confess, I have already begun looking into, in the very short time it took me to reach you. Old habits. I like to know a great deal about anyone whose voice reaches my line before I ever meet them in person." He tilted his head slightly, studying her with an intensity that felt less predatory than simply overwhelmingly curious. "You are a dispatcher yourself. The same work, in the daylight world, that I have spent the better part of a century doing quietly, in the dark. I find that a rather remarkable coincidence, don't you?" Ivy did not have the strength, in that moment, to argue with the word coincidence, though some small analytical corner of her mind, the same corner that had spent 4 years cataloguing patterns in emergency calls, filed the observation away for later. "The line," she said instead. "I called 911. That's a government line. That doesn't route to a private residence. That's not possible. Very little about tonight has been possible, in the strictest sense," Damien said. "And yet here we both are." He rose, offering her his hand, and Ivy looked at it for a long moment, aware of every instinct in her body, screaming 2 contradictory messages at once, run and trust, in a discord she had no immediate way of resolving. In the end, exhaustion and pain and something else, something she could not yet name, made the decision for her. She placed her hand in his, and his skin was cool, not cold exactly, but cool in the way of stone left in shade, and his grip closed around her fingers with a gentleness that felt entirely at odds with the violence she had just watched him commit without visible effort. "You need medical attention," Damien said, drawing her carefully to her feet, one arm coming around her shoulders to steady her when her knees threatened to give. "A concussion, at minimum, from the look of that bruise, and I suspect a fractured wrist as well, from the way you are holding it." "I need to file a report," Ivy said automatically, the professional part of her brain reasserting itself even through the ringing in her skull. "I need to document this. He violated the order. There's a whole process. Evidence. Photographs. I know exactly how this is supposed to. I know precisely how it is supposed to go as well," Damien said. and something dark passed briefly behind his eyes. And I know precisely how often it fails to go that way, when the man on the other end of the report wears the same uniform as the officer receiving it. I am not suggesting you abandon the process, Miss Calloway. I am suggesting that tonight you allow someone else to carry the weight of it, so that you might simply be permitted, for a few hours, to not be the person holding everything together. There was something in the way he said it, the specific, exhausted understanding in his voice, that undid the last of Ivy's resistance more thoroughly than any display of strength could have. She had spent 4 years being the calm voice on the other end of the worst nights of strangers' lives. She had spent 2 years before that being the one who had to hold herself together in the middle of her own private emergency, with no one on the other end of any line to talk her through it. She could not remember, sitting there in her ruined apartment with her wrist beginning to throb in earnest and the adrenaline finally draining out of her limbs, the last time anyone had offered to simply carry something for her, instead of asking her to carry it for them. "Okay," she heard herself say, the words small and unfamiliar in her own mouth. "Okay." Outside, the storm had not eased. If anything, it had strengthened. Wind driving sheets of rain sideways against the windows, hard enough to rattle the old panes in their frames. And somewhere far below, on a street that felt impossibly distant from the strange stillness of the room, Ivy could hear the faint, useless wail of a police siren finally, belatedly, arriving at an address that a broken tower had never actually managed to send them. "That will be a real patrol car," Damien said, glancing toward the window with mild distaste, responding to whatever the automated backup systems eventually managed to reroute after the storm knocked out the primary tower. "They will find an empty apartment and an unlocked door, and very little else to go on. I would prefer, if you are amenable, that we not be here when they arrive to ask questions. Neither of us is prepared to answer honestly tonight." Ivy thought, with the detached, floating clarity of mild shock, that she should have found the suggestion alarming. A stranger, however strange, was suggesting she leave the scene of a crime before the police could document it, and every instinct built over 4 years of professional training screamed that this was precisely the sort of advice she spent her shifts warning callers against. And yet the same 4 years had also taught her, with a bitterness she rarely let herself examine directly, exactly how often reports involving Marcus Doyle disappeared into some administrative void, exactly how often the paper trail she'd trusted so completely when advising strangers evaporated the moment it touched an officer's own colleagues. "There's a back stairwell," she said instead, surprising herself with how easily the words came, how quickly some deeper survival instinct simply took over where exhaustion had hollowed out her hesitation. "It comes out by the gravel lot." "I know," Damien said. "I used it on the way in." He gathered a coat from the hook by her door, an old grey peacoat that smelled faintly of rain and dust, and settled it over her shoulders with a care that felt almost formal, almost ceremonial, before guiding her down the narrow back stairs and out into the storm. The black SUV waiting at the mouth of the alley had not been there when she arrived home, and Ivy did not ask how it had gotten there or how the driver, a silent, broad-shouldered man who did not turn around once during the entire ride, had known precisely where to meet them without a single word being exchanged. She had run out, for the moment, of questions her mind had the capacity to hold. The city blurred past the rain-streaked windows, streetlights smearing into long gold ribbons, and Ivy sat with her injured wrist cradled against her chest, watching the glass, feeling the strange, cottony distance of shock settle more fully over her thoughts with every passing block. Beside her, Damien sat with his hands folded over one knee, watching her with an attention that felt neither predatory nor detached, but something closer to careful, the way a man might watch a wound he was not yet certain had finished bleeding. "You are wondering if this is a mistake," he said, after several minutes of silence. "I'm wondering about a lot of things," Ivy admitted. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears, thin and far away. "Mostly I'm wondering why a man who can apparently rearrange gravity decided the best use of his evening was answering a wrong number." "It was not a wrong number," Damien said. "It was, as far as I can determine, the correct number, rooted by an infrastructure failure to a line that has not received a call in over a decade. I do not believe in a great deal, Miss Calloway. After 4.5 centuries of watching the world reorganize itself again and again around the same handful of cruelties. But I have learned to pay very close attention when the universe goes to a great deal of trouble to put two particular things in the same place at the same time." 4.5 centuries, Ivy repeated, and heard, distantly, the small, hysterical edge creeping into her own voice. "Right. Okay. You are permitted to be in shock," Damien said, not unkindly. "Most people, presented with tonight's evidence, require considerably longer than the length of a car ride to arrive at anything resembling acceptance. I do not expect you to simply believe me. I expect you, eventually, to see enough that belief becomes unnecessary." The SUV turned off the expressway and began climbing, the streets narrowing and darkening as they left the more familiar grid of the city behind, until finally they slowed at the base of a building Ivy vaguely recognized from 100 glimpses of the skyline, a slender, elegant tower of dark glass and stone that had always struck her, on the rare occasions she noticed it at all, as somehow older than the buildings around it, though she could not have said why. A private elevator carried them upward in silence, the number display counting floors that seemed to climb well past what she remembered the building's exterior suggesting. And when the doors finally opened, Ivy stepped out into a space that did not belong, in any way she could immediately reconcile, to the 21st century city she had left behind. The penthouse unfolded before her in dark wood and old stone and towering windows that framed the storm-tossed lake like a painting, shelves of books that looked genuinely ancient rather than decoratively distressed, a fireplace large enough to stand inside that crackled with a fire that had, as far as Ivy could tell, been burning without anyone present to tend it. A woman appeared almost instantly at Damien's side, silent and efficient, dressed in the simple, elegant black of household staff, and though the woman's face was entirely human in its warmth and concern, there was something in the quiet, practiced way she assessed Ivy's injuries that suggested this was not the first time she had been asked to care for someone, brought home in the middle of the night, under circumstances no one intended to fully explain. "This is Mrs. Alvarez," Damien said. "She has looked after this house and everyone who passes through it for the better part of 30 years. She will see to your wrist and your head, and I promise you her hands are considerably gentler than mine, and considerably more qualified for the task." "I have a nursing background," Mrs. Alvarez said, already guiding Ivy toward a low couch near the fire with the brisk, kind authority of a woman who had clearly done this before. "Emergency room. 22 years. Before I came to work here. Let's have a look at that wrist, sweetheart." Ivy sat, allowing herself for the first time all night, to simply be handled rather than handling, and watched through the fog of exhaustion and the slow, throbbing ache blooming across the side of her skull. As Mrs. Alvarez worked with quick, competent hands, splinting her wrist with practiced efficiency, checking her pupils with a small penlight, murmuring reassurances in a low, steady voice that Ivy recognized, with a strange jolt, as almost identical in cadence to the voice she herself used on frightened callers. Damien stood a short distance away throughout the examination, saying nothing, watching everything, his stillness somehow more attentive than any hovering concern could have been. "You have a mild concussion and a hairline fracture," Mrs. Alvarez said finally, taping off the splint. "Nothing that requires a hospital tonight, though you should see an orthopedist within the week to be certain it sets properly. You're going to want to rest, and you're going to want to let that head clear before you make any decisions you can't take back." "Thank you," Ivy said, and meant it in the small, wondering way of someone who had not expected kindness to still exist as an available option on a night that had begun with a locked door standing open in the dark. "There is a guest room prepared," Damien said. Once Mrs. Alvarez had gathered her supplies and withdrawn, leaving the two of them alone again in the vast, firelit quiet of the room. "You are, of course, under no obligation to stay. I can have you return to any address you choose tonight, and I will arrange for security to watch your building until Detective Doyle's continued absence has been confirmed. But I would ask you to consider, before you decide, that the same broken door which allowed him into your home tonight will still be broken tomorrow, and the man who walked through it once has already demonstrated a willingness to do so again." Ivy stared into the fire, exhaustion and pain, and the surreal, dreamlike unreality of the entire night pressing down on her all at once, and found, when she finally spoke, that the professional part of herself, the dispatcher who had spent 4 years assessing risk in strangers' voices, agreed with him entirely, even as every other part of her recoiled at how quickly her life had been upended. "One night," she said, "I need to think. I can't just everything about tonight is insane, and I need to actually think before I decide anything else." "One night," Damien agreed, with a small, formal inclination of his head that felt absurdly like something out of a much older world than the one she had left behind 3 hours earlier. "For what it is worth, Miss Calloway, I do not expect gratitude, and I do not expect trust. I expect only that you allow yourself to heal under a roof where no one intends you harm, for as long as that takes." She slept, eventually, in a bedroom larger than her entire apartment, in a bed that felt like sinking into a warm, dreamless cloud, the ache in her wrist dulled by whatever Mrs. Alvarez had given her. And if she dreamed at all that first night, she did not remember it in the morning, waking instead to pale gray daylight filtering through gauzy curtains and the disorienting, momentary conviction that the entire previous night had been some fever-born hallucination, until she moved her arm and felt the solid, undeniable weight of the splint and remembered everything at once. She found Damien, an hour later, in the same book-lined study where she had first seen the penthouse's interior, sitting behind a heavy desk with a stack of papers in front of him that looked, from a distance, disconcertingly like a police personnel file. He rose the moment she appeared in the doorway, the same formal courtesy from the night before intact in the way he pulled out a chair for her. poured coffee she had not asked for but desperately wanted, and waited, with visible patience, for her to speak first. "I want to understand what you are," Ivy said, once she had wrapped both hands around the warm mug, grounding herself in the simple, mundane comfort of it. Not the polite version, the real one. Damien considered her for a long moment, something in his expression shifting, settling into a gravity that made him look, briefly, every one of the 4.5 centuries he claimed to carry. "I am a vampire," he said simply. "Not the theatrical creature of your films, though I confess some of the details are not entirely inaccurate. I do not age. I do not require sunlight, though it does not harm me the way legend insists. I require blood to sustain myself. And I possess strength, speed, and certain other abilities that exceed human capability by a considerable margin. I have ruled, in the particular fractured, hidden hierarchy of my kind, over the vampires of this city and its surrounding territories for the better part of 2 centuries, a position that carries with it rather more political complexity than I suspect you have the patience for this morning." Ivy absorbed this with the same slow, methodical calm she brought to every emergency call, cataloguing the information rather than reacting to it, a habit so deeply ingrained by now that it operated almost independently of her conscious will. "And the phone line?" she said. "The one that rang in a building where nothing like that should have been possible. I installed it in 1931. Damien said, in a moment of what I can only describe, in hindsight, as naive idealism. I believed then that I might use it to intervene in the worst of human suffering before it became irreversible, before some lesser and hungrier creature of my kind found a desperate mortal and saw only an opportunity. I used it perhaps a dozen times across 9 decades. Last night was the first time in 11 years that it rang at all, and it did so, as best my own people have been able to determine this morning, because a storm severed a transmission line at precisely the moment your call needed somewhere to go, and an old, forgotten backup relay, buried deep enough in the city's infrastructure that no modern engineer remembers it exists, sent your voice to the only place still listening on the other end. That's an enormous coincidence. It is, Damien agreed. I have lived long enough, Miss Calloway, to distrust enormous coincidences rather thoroughly. I do not yet know what to make of this one. I only know that the moment I heard your voice on that line, calm, even as a man's fist connected with your skull, I recognized something in it I have not encountered in longer than I care to admit. What? Someone who has spent her entire life learning how to sound unafraid, Damien said quietly. For the benefit of people who needed her to be. I know that particular kind of exhaustion rather intimately, though I confess my own version of it has taken a considerably longer and stranger road to arrive at the same place. Before Ivy could respond, the heavy study door swung open without a knock, and a woman entered the room with the unhurried, proprietary confidence of someone who had never once in her long existence questioned whether she was welcome anywhere she chose to walk. She was tall, pale, in a way that seemed to catch and hold the grey morning light rather than simply reflect it. Her hair, a sheet of white blonde pulled back with severe elegance, and her eyes, when they landed on Ivy, carried an immediate, unmistakable contempt that required no translation across any divide of species or century. "Well?" the woman said, her voice carrying the faint, cultured trace of an accent Ivy could not quite place. old money layered over something older still. I heard rumors this morning that our sovereign had brought a stray home from his little rescue mission. I did not expect her to be sitting in your study drinking coffee like she belongs here, Damien. Celine, Damien said, and something in his tone had gone instantly, unmistakably cold. You were not summoned. I rarely am, Celine replied, unbothered, her gaze sweeping over Ivy with the slow, cataloguing thoroughness of a predator, assessing whether something was worth the effort of a kill. And yet, I find myself here regardless, because the entire court is already whispering about the human dispatcher the king carried out of a storm like some drowned little bird. Tell me, sweetheart, she said, addressing Ivy directly for the first time, her smile sharp and entirely without warmth. Do you have any idea at all what you have just walked into? Ivy, 4 years of training, rising instinctively to meet a threat she did not fully understand, but recognized instantly in her own body, set down her coffee cup with deliberate, careful, calm, and met the other woman's gaze without looking away. No, she said, but I get the feeling you're about to enjoy telling me. Something flickered behind Celine's eyes. Surprise quickly buried beneath renewed contempt, as though the correct response to her presence had always and only ever been fear, and the absence of it offended her on some deep personal level. Careful little thing, aren't you? She said, circling slowly around the edge of the desk, her heels silent against the stone floor, in a way that struck Ivy, even through her exhaustion, as deeply unnatural. Do you know what it took to become the one standing beside Damien Ashworth? Human. Do you know how many centuries of alliances, how much blood spilled in careful, deliberate quantities, how much patience it required to earn even a fraction of the trust he has apparently handed to you? In the span of a single night. I didn't ask for anything, Ivy said. I called for an ambulance and got him instead. If you've got a problem with how the phone lines work, I'd suggest taking it up with the storm. A short, sharp laugh escaped Celine, more surprised than amused. She has a mouth on her, she said to Damien, though her eyes never left Ivy. I suppose that will make it more entertaining when the court finally tears her apart. You know how this ends, Damien. You know it as well as I do. You cannot simply pluck a mortal off the street and install her in your home like a favored pet without the rest of the city taking notice. And the rest of the city, I promise you, will not be nearly so restrained in their curiosity as I am being right now. Celine. Damien's voice had not risen, had not gained a single degree of visible heat, and yet the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees regardless, the fire in the hearth guttering briefly before steadying. You will remember whose house you are standing in. I remember perfectly well, Celine said, though something in her posture shifted, a fractional retreat that told Ivy, more clearly than any words could have, precisely how much authority lived behind Damien's quiet correction. I am simply reminding you of a truth you seem, this morning, to have conveniently forgotten. The Vasilev family has spent 40 years positioning their youngest daughter for exactly the role this human woman appears to be stumbling into by pure accident. If word reaches them that you have chosen, even provisionally, even temporarily, to shelter a mortal in your own home, they will not sit quietly and wait to see how it resolves itself. They will act, and I do not believe, sovereign or not, that you currently have the political capital to survive that fight without cost. Let me worry about the Vasilevs, Damien said, Someone has to, Celine shot back. Since you seem entirely preoccupied with playing rescuer to a girl who does not even understand what she is looking at. She turned back to Ivy one final time, and for just a moment, something almost like genuine warning flickered behind the contempt. A fractional softening that Ivy filed away without fully understanding it. A word of advice, dispatcher, since I doubt anyone else in this house will bother giving it to you honestly. Whatever kindness you think you are seeing this morning, it will not protect you from what is coming. This world does not forgive mortals for surviving it. Enjoy your coffee while it lasts. She swept out of the room as unhurriedly as she had entered it, the heavy door falling shut behind her, with a sound that seemed to echo far longer than it should have, and Ivy sat in the ringing silence that followed, turning the coffee mug slowly between her hands, aware of Damien watching her, with an expression she could not quite read. "I take it that's the welcoming committee," Ivy said, finally. "That is Celine Marchetti," Damien said, something weary threading through his voice now that the visitor was gone. "One of my oldest allies, and, on her better days, one of my most trusted advisors." She is not entirely wrong, unfortunately, about the danger her warning describes, even if her manner of delivering it leaves a great deal to be desired. What danger exactly? I'm not trying to be anybody's queen. I just want to go home and not have my ex-boyfriend break down my door again. Damien was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, there was a careful, deliberate weight to his words that told Ivy he had been considering how to explain this since well before Celine's interruption. "There are families within my court," he said. "Ancient bloodlines who have spent generations, sometimes centuries, positioning their daughters and sons to eventually stand beside whoever holds the throne of this territory. It is, in its own cold way, not so different from the political marriages of human royal houses in centuries past. I have resisted those arrangements for longer than most of them care to remember, and that resistance has not made me popular among the families in question." "Okay," Ivy said slowly, "but I still don't see what that has to do with me. I'm not a vampire. I'm not part of any bloodline. I'm a dispatcher with a broken wrist and a restraining order that apparently means nothing." "That," Damien said, "is precisely what troubles me. You are, by every measure that should matter, an entirely ordinary mortal woman, and yet a call that should have been physically impossible to route to my line found its way there regardless. On the one night in 11 years, that line was capable of receiving it, carrying a voice that struck something in me I have not felt reach me in longer than I can comfortably measure. I do not believe in coincidence, Miss Calloway. I believe increasingly that something about you is not quite as ordinary as either of us currently understands." Ivy set down the coffee mug, her hands, despite everything, entirely steady. The old dispatcher instinct, asserting itself even now, even here, in a room full of impossible things. "You think I'm what?" she said. "Special? Chosen? I've heard that line from men before, Damien. It's usually the opening act, right before things get a lot worse." "I am aware of how it sounds," Damien said, and something in his expression, some flicker of old, weary self-awareness, told her he meant it. "I am not asking you to believe it. I am asking you to consider the possibility. While your wrist heals and your head clears, that the door you walked through last night may lead somewhere considerably larger than either of us expected when a storm cut a wire it should never have been able to reach. Outside, the grey morning had begun to lighten, the storm finally breaking apart over the lake, pale sun pushing weakly through the retreating clouds, and Ivy sat in the quiet, book-lined study of a man who claimed 4.5 centuries of memory, turning over, for the first time since the previous night's chaos, had swallowed her whole, the small, insistent question that would not leave her alone. If a phone line built to answer emergencies had somehow known to reach him, and only him, on the one night in over a decade it was capable of doing so, then what, exactly, had it recognized in her voice that made the difference between an ordinary tragedy and an extraordinary rescue? She did not yet have an answer. But she understood, sitting there with the morning light finally breaking gold across the surface of the lake, that whatever answer eventually arrived was going to change the entire shape of the life she had spent 2 years fighting so hard to rebuild. And that Celine Marchetti's warning, however cruelly delivered, had not been wrong about one thing. Something was already coming for her. She simply did not yet know its name. That afternoon, while Mrs. Alvarez changed the dressing on her wrist and Damien disappeared into a series of low, urgent phone calls behind the closed door of his study, Ivy sat by the tall windows overlooking the lake and did the only thing 4 years of professional training had ever really taught her to do in the face of an unfolding emergency. She started asking questions, quietly, methodically, cataloguing every strange detail of the last 12 hours, the way she would have catalogued the details of any call, building a picture piece by piece instead of surrendering to the fear trying to pull her under. She thought about the way the light bulb had dimmed when Damien's voice dropped low enough to make Marcus Doyle obey without argument. She thought about the particular, deliberate care with which Mrs. Alvarez had splintered her wrist, the ease of someone who had clearly done this before, for other guests, under other circumstances. No one in this house seemed eager to discuss. She thought about Celine's warning, the flicker of something almost like genuine concern buried beneath all that cold contempt. And she thought, most of all, about the sound of her own voice on that recording, calm even as she was struck, calm in a way she had spent years training herself to be, and had never once stopped to ask what that training might have cost her, or what it might impossibly mean. She did not yet know that somewhere across the city, in a precinct locker room that smelled of stale coffee and old sweat, Marcus Doyle was sitting with his head in his hands, staring at a burner phone he had just used to make a call to a number he had spent the better part of the morning trying to forget he still had. A number belonging to a private security contractor who specialized, according to whispers Marcus had picked up over years of working cases that brushed against the city's stranger edges, in problems the regular department did not have the tools or the stomach to solve. She did not know that Marcus, humiliated and furious and freshly aware of exactly how far outmatched he had been the night before, had decided that if he could not win this fight with a badge and a service weapon, he would simply find people who could win it with something worse. And she did not yet know that 4 floors below the penthouse where she sat watching the storm finally clear over Lake Michigan, in a private archive room lined with records far older than the city itself, a young clerk in Damien's service had just found, buried in a box of documents no one had opened in nearly a century, a single sealed letter bearing her family name, written in a hand that predated her own birth by nearly 80 years, sealed with a wax stamp shaped like a phone receiver wrapped in a laurel wreath, marked only with 3 words that would, in the days to come, unravel everything. Ivy Calloway believed she understood about the ordinary, unremarkable life she had built for herself in the quiet hours between other people's emergencies. To be answered, the letter sat on the desk between them for a long time before either of them touched it. Damien had brought it to her himself, 2 days after the storm. Once, Mrs. Alvarez had cleared her to move around the penthouse without dizziness. Once the bruise along her cheekbone had faded from angry purple to a sickly yellow-green that made her wince every time she caught her reflection. He set it down on the low table beside the fire with a gravity that told Ivy, before he said a single word, that whatever it contained mattered a great deal more than an ordinary piece of paper had any right to. "It was found 4 floors below us," he said, "in an archive room where my household keeps records that stretch back considerably further than most human institutions bother preserving anything. It bears your family name, Miss Calloway." Calloway. It was sealed in 1943. Ivy stared at the yellowed envelope, at the wax seal stamped with an image she did not recognize, a phone receiver wrapped in a laurel wreath, and felt something cold and unfamiliar settle low in her stomach. "That's not possible," she said. "My family's from Ohio. We've never had money, we've never had land. We've never had anything worth writing down in some ancient vampire archive. This has to be a different Calloway." "It may well be," Damien admitted. "I do not yet have proof of a direct line, but I have lived long enough to distrust the word coincidence rather thoroughly, and I confess I have distrusted it even more thoroughly since the night a broken tower routed your voice to a phone that had not rung in 11 years. He gestured toward the letter. "Would you like me to open it, or would you prefer to do it yourself?" Ivy reached for it before she had fully decided to, her fingers still stiff inside the splint on her wrist, working carefully at the brittle wax seal until it cracked and fell away in small, dry flakes. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the handwriting careful and formal in the way of someone raised in an era that still valued penmanship as a mark of character, and Ivy read it once silently, then a second time aloud, her voice growing quieter with every line. "To whoever holds the line after me," the letter began. "My name was Margaret Calloway, and I served for 11 years as a telephone operator in this city, in the years before the war swallowed most of what I knew and loved. I write this not because I expect anyone to read it, but because the man who calls himself sovereign of this city's shadows has asked me to record what I have come to understand, in the hope that someday some daughter of my line might need to understand it too. There is something in our blood, in the women of this family, that the creatures of the dark world can sense the way a compass senses north. I do not know its origin. I do not know its purpose, except that every one of us, as far back as my grandmother could recount, has found herself drawn toward work that demands a calm voice in the presence of terror, toward the sound of other people's emergencies, as naturally as water finds the lowest ground. My grandmother tended the wounded during a fever outbreak that killed half our town, and never once let her voice shake. My mother sat with the dying in a charity hospital for 40 years. I sit now in a small dark room full of switchboards, connecting frightened voices to the help they are calling for. And I have learned, in 11 years of this work, that my own voice has a strange and undeniable power to settle a panicking stranger faster than any other operator on my shift. Lord Ashworth tells me this is no accident. He tells me our line was marked generations ago by an old and terrible bargain struck between one of my ancestors and a creature of his kind, though the details of that bargain have been lost to time and to the deliberate erasure of records that a family with nothing wished no one to ever trace back to them. He tells me our blood carries an echo that calls to whatever remains of humanity in the oldest and most powerful of his kind, and that someday, when the two things that answer that call finally meet under the right circumstances, something in the old bargain will finish what it began. I do not fully understand what this means, and I confess I am afraid of it. But I write this letter and seal it with the old mark so that whoever finds it, whoever she is, will know that she is not imagining the strangeness of her own life. She is not broken for finding comfort in other people's chaos. She is simply carrying forward what the women of our family have always carried, whether we understood it or not. The letter ended there, unsigned, except for a small, precise M, and Ivy sat holding it for a long time, the fire crackling beside her, before she trusted her own voice enough to speak. "This doesn't prove anything," she said finally. "This could be anyone. This could be a completely different family that happens to share a name. It could be," Damien agreed. "I would not ask you to accept it as certainty. I would only ask you to consider that whatever brought your voice to my line 2 nights ago did not arrive there by mere mechanical accident, and that the woman who wrote this letter 80 years ago appears to have understood something about her own life that mirrors, with an unsettling precision, the shape of yours." Ivy set the letter down carefully, as though it might crumble further under too much handling, and looked out at the lake, grey and restless beyond the tall windows. "I've spent 4 years telling myself that being good at calming down strangers was just a skill," she said quietly. "Something I got good at because I had to be, because of Marcus, because of everything before him too. I never let myself think it meant anything beyond that." "Perhaps it does not," Damien said. "Perhaps it is simply a skill, hard-won and admirable in its own right. And this letter is nothing more than an old woman's attempt to make sense of a life that felt, to her, inexplicably shaped by forces larger than herself. I have lived a very long time, Miss Calloway, and I have learned that certainty is a luxury the world rarely affords anyone, mortal or otherwise. I only know that I have not felt what I felt on that phone line in longer than I care to measure, and I do not believe it was nothing." Ivy did not have an answer for that. She sat instead in the quiet, firelit room, turning the old letter over in her hands, feeling the strange, vertiginous sensation of her ordinary life tilting further and further away from anything she had ever expected it to become. That evening, unable to sleep, unable to stop turning Margaret Calloway's careful, formal handwriting over in her mind, Ivy found herself wandering the penthouse's long, book-lined corridors until she came upon Damien, standing alone at the tall windows of the great room, watching the lake without any visible purpose. Beyond simply watching it, a glass of dark wine, untouched in his hand. "Can't sleep either," she said, settling into the window seat a careful distance from him. "I sleep very little," Damien said. "A peculiarity of age, more than of nature. The centuries accumulate a great deal of restlessness that daylight hours alone cannot absorb." He glanced at her, something gentling in his expression. "You are thinking of the letter." "I'm thinking of you," Ivy admitted, surprising herself with the honesty of it. 4.5 centuries is a long time to be someone's sovereign. I keep trying to imagine what that actually looks like. day to day. And I can't. I don't have a frame of reference for it. Damien was quiet for a long moment, turning the wine glass slowly in his hand. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that told Ivy she was about to hear something he did not offer easily. I was born in 1561, he said, in a small village outside what is now considered the Scottish borders, the third son of a minor landholder who had considerably more pride than sense. I do not remember my mortal life with any particular fondness. It was brief, and it was hard, and it ended, as so many mortal lives did in that century, with a fever that swept through our village and left half of it dead within a month. But you didn't die, Ivy said, quietly. I very nearly did. Damien said, I was saved, if that is the correct word for it, by a creature of considerable age, who found something in my dying that interested her enough to intervene. I will not pretend the centuries that followed were kind ones. I spent the better part of 200 years learning what I had become through trial and considerable error, doing things in that learning that I do not discuss and do not forgive myself for, regardless of how thoroughly the intervening centuries have distanced me from the man who did them. Ivy studied his profile in the low light. The sharp lines of his face softened by something that looked, for the first time since she had met him, genuinely vulnerable. What changed? She asked. I grew tired, Damien said simply, of violence for its own sake, of the endless, grinding cruelty that seemed to define every court and every century I found myself moving through. I claimed sovereignty over this city 200 years ago, not out of ambition, though I will not pretend ambition played no part in it, but because I had come to believe that if creatures like myself were going to exist in the shadows of human civilization regardless of what anyone wished, then someone among us ought to at least try to make that existence less catastrophic for the mortals unlucky enough to cross our paths. The telephone line I built in 1931 was born of that same restless, perhaps naive conviction. I wished, in whatever small way I could manage, to be something other than what most of my kind allowed themselves to become. That's not naive, Ivy said. That's the same thing I've spent 4 years trying to do every single night I put on this headset. Just refusing to let the worst version of the world be the only version anyone gets. Something shifted in Damien's expression, warm and startled in equal measure, as though she had articulated something about himself he had never quite managed to say so plainly on his own. I have ruled this city for 2 centuries, he said quietly, and in all that time, I do not believe anyone has ever described my choices back to me with such immediate, uncomplicated clarity. You have a gift for that, Ivy Calloway, for finding the plain, true shape of things beneath all the complications people bury them under. Occupational hazard, Ivy said, though her voice had gone soft, something warm and unguarded moving through her chest that she did not yet have a name for. You spend enough nights listening to people fall apart. You get very good at finding the one true thing, holding them together underneath it. They sat together at the window for a long while after that, the city glittering below them, saying very little, and Ivy found, in the comfortable, unhurried silence between them, the first real inkling of what it might feel like to build something steady out of 2 very different kinds of loneliness, finally finding each other in the dark. It was, she thought, watching the last of the storm clouds finally clear from the horizon. An entirely unexpected place to find herself, 4 days after the worst night of her life. But sitting there, in the quiet, firelit warmth of a room built by a man who had spent 4 centuries learning how to be gentle in a world that had given him every reason not to be, she found she was not, for the first time in longer than she could remember, afraid of where her own life might be leading her. It was the following afternoon, while Mrs. Alvarez changed the dressing on her wrist, and Damien disappeared into a series of low, urgent phone calls behind the closed door of his study, that the call from Celine came through, shattering whatever fragile peace the last 2 days had managed to build. "There's a call for you, my lord," Mrs. Alvarez said. "It's Celine. She says it's urgent, and she says she wants Miss Calloway to hear it too." The call came through on a speaker built into the study's old radio cabinet, Celine's voice crackling with an urgency that stripped away every trace of the cold, aristocratic amusement she had worn during her first visit. "I've been watching Doyle since he left her building," Celine said without preamble. "I did not trust him to simply walk away, and it seems my instincts were correct. He met this morning with a man named Aldrich Voss." Damien's expression sharpened instantly, something old and wary moving behind his eyes. "Voss is dead," he said. "I attended to that myself, decades ago." "Apparently not thoroughly enough," Celine said. "He's resurfaced under a different name, running a private security firm out of the western suburbs that specializes, according to what my people have managed to piece together, in exactly the kind of problem your little dispatcher currently represents. He knows what we are, Damien. He's known for a very long time, and he's spent the years since you supposedly finished him building a network of mercenaries who know how to hunt our kind and hurt us, using methods that have nothing to do with silver bullets and folklore. Doyle hired him this morning. He's paying with money he does not have, which tells me he is either desperate or being financed by someone with an interest in seeing this situation resolved badly. "The Vasilevs," Damien said, and the name came out low and cold. "That would be my guess as well," Celine said. "A human ex-boyfriend with a grudge and a police badge is a remarkably convenient weapon for a family that wants to see your new favorite mortal removed without ever dirtying their own hands. If Voss's people succeed in killing her, or worse, capturing her, the Vasilevs get exactly what they want, and you get to spend the next decade explaining to the entire court why you could not protect a woman you swore, publicly, to shelter under your roof." Ivy, listening to all of this with the particular focused calm she had spent years perfecting for exactly this kind of unfolding crisis, felt the shape of the danger settle into something concrete and workable, something she could finally actually do something about, instead of simply absorbing it as one more wave of incomprehensible fear. "How many people does Voss have?" she asked. And both Damien and the radio speaker went quiet for a moment, as though surprised by the steadiness of her own voice cutting into the conversation. "Unknown," Celine said after a beat. "Historically, he's operated in teams of 8 to 12. Former military, mostly, supplemented by whatever occult resources he's managed to accumulate over the years." "Why do you ask, dispatcher?" "Because if they're coming here," Ivy said, "I want to know what we're actually dealing with, instead of just being told to sit somewhere safe and wait for it to be over. I spend my entire career coordinating exactly this kind of chaos. I'd rather use that than hide from it. There was a pause on the line, and when Celine spoke again, something in her voice had shifted. The contempt from their first meeting replaced by something more careful, more considering. "Well," she said, "perhaps the letter in the archive was onto something after all." Damien, who had been standing very still throughout the entire exchange, finally turned to look at Ivy with an expression she had not seen from him before, something that mingled concern and a reluctant, dawning respect in equal measure. "You do not have to involve yourself in this," he said. "I can end Voss's threat myself tonight, before he has the chance to organize anything resembling an actual assault on this building." "You could," Ivy agreed. "But Marcus knows things about me that Voss's people don't. He knows my schedule, my habits, the names of people I care about, the exact shape of every fear I've ever tried to hide from him. If this turns into a siege instead of a clean strike, you're going to need someone in this building who can read chaos in real time and tell you where it's actually coming from, instead of guessing. That's not a skill you have, Damien. It's mine." Something in the room shifted, the last trace of Damien's protective hesitation giving way, slowly, to the same careful, dawning respect Celine's voice had already carried. "Very well," he said. "Then we prepare properly, and we prepare together." Over the following 2 days, the penthouse transformed. Mrs. Alvarez oversaw the reinforcement of every door and window with a brisk efficiency that suggested this was, once again, not the first crisis she had helped this household weather. Celine arrived in person this time, her earlier contempt entirely absent, replaced by the focused, professional energy of someone assembling a defense rather than delivering a warning. And it was Celine who first suggested, almost grudgingly, that Ivy's instincts might prove more useful than anyone in the household had initially assumed. "You said you coordinate chaos for a living," Celine said, standing over a set of building schematics spread across the study's long table. "Prove it. Tell me what you see." Ivy studied the blueprints with the same methodical focus she brought to every incoming call, tracing sightlines, choke points, the vulnerable seams where a defense might fracture under pressure. "This stairwell," she said, tapping a narrow corridor on the east side of the building. "It's the only access point that isn't covered by a camera. If I were planning an assault on this building, that's where I'd send my first team, quiet, before anyone upstairs even knows they're inside. And this elevator bank," she continued, moving her finger to the building's central shaft, "is a trap either way. Whoever controls it controls vertical movement for the entire tower. You want someone stationed here who can shut it down remotely the second things go wrong, not after." Celine glanced at Damien, something unreadable passing between them, and when she spoke again, the last trace of condescension had vanished entirely from her voice. "She's right," Celine said, "about both. I would not have thought to flag the east stairwell at all." "I told you," Damien said quietly, watching Ivy with an expression that had grown, over the last 2 days, warmer and more openly admiring than she had yet allowed herself to fully notice. "There is nothing accidental about what was drawn to that phone line." Ivy did not have a response for that. Not yet, too absorbed in the practical work of mapping vulnerabilities, to examine the strange, unfamiliar warmth blooming quietly in her own chest every time Damien looked at her that way. But she filed it away. the way she filed away every detail that mattered, for a moment when there might finally be time to sit with it properly. That moment did not come as quickly as she hoped. It was on the third night, well past midnight, with the city spread out, glittering and indifferent below the tall windows, that the building's security system chirped a soft, urgent alert, and Ivy, who had insisted on sleeping lightly with a radio close at hand, was awake and moving before the second chirp finished sounding. "East stairwell," she said, already pulling on the jacket. "Mrs." Alvarez had left folded by the door, her voice dropping instantly into the flat, controlled cadence of a woman who had spent 4 years being the calmest person on every worst night of a stranger's life. Multiple heat signatures, moving fast. They found the blind spot. Damien was already at her side. The languid, unhurried grace he usually carried, replaced by something sharper, more coiled, an ancient predator settling fully into the shape of a war he had fought 1,000 times before across 4.5 centuries. "How many?" he asked. "The sensors reading 6, maybe 7, Ivy said, studying the small monitor bolted into the study wall, her hands steady, despite the adrenaline flooding her system. "That's not a full assault team. That's a breach unit. They're going to try to get inside fast and quiet, secure a foothold, then bring in the rest once they know the layout's clear. Marcus wouldn't be with them," she added, almost to herself, working through the tactics with the same rapid, structured clarity she used every night at her console. "He doesn't have the training for a breach like this. He'll be coordinating from somewhere close, somewhere with a clear line of communication. If we can find his position, we cut the head off whatever's actually running this." Celine, arriving in the doorway already dressed for violence in dark, close-fitted clothing that gave her freedom of movement, glanced at Ivy with something that had, somewhere over the last 3 days, transformed fully into respect. "I told you she'd be useful," she said to Damien, though her eyes stayed on Ivy. "Get to the security room, lock yourself in with the cameras and the radio, and talk us through this, the way you'd talk any other caller through the worst night of their life. We will need eyes. We cannot get any other way." Ivy nodded, already moving, and if some small, quiet part of her recognized the strange irony of the moment, a dispatcher, finally standing on the other side of the call she had spent 4 years imagining. She did not have time to dwell on it. She reached the reinforced security room at the center of the penthouse's lower level in under a minute, sealing the door behind her, and settled into the chair in front of a wall of monitors with the same automatic, practiced calm she brought to every shift, snapping a headset over her ears and opening a channel to the small earpiece Damien had insisted she carry from the moment the preparations began. "I have eyes on the east stairwell," she said, her voice dropping instantly into the flat, unhurried cadence of dispatch. A voice built specifically to cut through chaos rather than add to it. 6 confirmed hostiles, moving in pairs, standard breach formation. They just cleared the second-floor landing. You have maybe 90 seconds before they reach the service corridor outside the kitchen. Copy? Damien's voice came back, low and controlled. And somewhere on the monitor, Ivy could see him moving through the darkened lower hallway, a blur of impossible speed and stillness in equal measure. "Celine?" "With you," Celine's voice cut in. "There's a 7th, Ivy said suddenly, her eyes catching movement on a camera feed covering the parking structure 2 levels below. A figure standing apart from the main breach team, watching from a distance with the particular, restless stillness of a man used to commanding operations from a safe remove rather than participating in them directly. Camera 4, Sub-Level 2. That's your command element. If that's not Voss himself, that's whoever's running this for him. Description, Damien said. Male. Maybe 50. Heavyset. Wearing a tactical vest, but no weapon drawn. He's got a radio in each hand. That's your target if you want to end this fast, instead of clearing 6 armed operators room by room. There was a brief pause, filled only with the sound of Damien's footsteps, and, faintly, the first sounds of the breach team reaching the kitchen corridor. And then his voice came back, quieter, almost approving. Understood. Celine, take the stairwell team. I'll take Sub-Level 2. What followed, over the next several minutes, was a controlled, brutal efficiency that Ivy watched unfold across her bank of monitors with the same detached, professional focus she had spent 4 years cultivating for exactly this kind of unfolding emergency, narrating each development into her headset in the flat, unhurried cadence of a woman who had never once, in her entire career, allowed panic to reach her own voice, even as the worst possible outcomes played out in front of her. Contact in the kitchen corridor, she said, watching Celine's blur of motion intersect with the first pair of breach team operators, the confrontation ending, from what the low-resolution camera could show her, in a matter of seconds. 2 down, 4 remaining, splitting into the east and west hallways. Copy, Celine's voice, breathing hard but controlled. Taking east, then west is coming toward the study, Ivy said instantly, already tracking the movement on a different feed, her mind working 3 steps ahead in the particular way that 4 years of dispatch training had built into her almost as reflex. That's a dead end unless they know about the service elevator. If they find it, they'll be on this floor in under a minute. I'm on Sub-Level 2, Damien's voice cut through, tighter now. An edge of something dangerous threading beneath the control. Confirmed target, Voss, Ivy watched. On the grainy, black and white feed from camera 4, as the heavy-set man in the tactical vest turned, radio dropping from his hand, and even without sound she could read, in the sudden, rigid stillness of his posture, the exact moment he understood what was standing in front of him. Meanwhile, on the monitor tracking the west hallway, the 2 remaining breach operators had reached a junction Ivy recognized instantly from 3 days of studying the building's schematics, a narrow service corridor that fed, if they turned left, directly toward the study, or, if they turned right, into a maintenance closet that dead-ended against reinforced concrete. She watched them pause, radios raised, clearly awaiting instruction from a command element that had already gone dark, and understood, with the particular cold clarity of someone who had spent years reading the small tells of frightened, uncertain people, that they were rattled, that the loss of contact with Voss had shaken something loose in their coordination. They're hesitating, she said into the headset, tracking the pause with a dispatcher's practiced patience. Command's gone quiet on them, and they don't like it. This is the moment they either fall back or commit. Celine, if you can reach that junction in the next 30 seconds, I think you can push them into retreating instead of forcing a fight. On my way. Celine's voice came back, breathless but sharp, and a moment later, Ivy watched a blur of motion sweep into the edge of the camera frame, the two operators spinning to meet a threat that arrived faster than their training had prepared them for. "He's reaching for something," Ivy said sharply, catching the motion at the edge of the frame on camera 4, a glint of metal from a case near Voss's feet that did not belong to any standard weapon she recognized. "Damien. Wait. That's not a gun. That's..." The explosion of white light that flooded the camera feed came a half-second later, washing the monitor briefly to static, and Ivy's heart lurched hard against her ribs before the image resolved again. Damien still standing, staggered but upright, one hand raised against his face, the tactical case at Voss's feet, now smoking and spent. "UV charge." Damien's voice came through the earpiece, rough but steady. Concentrated. He came prepared. "Are you hurt?" Ivy asked, and heard, distantly, how thoroughly her own trained calm had abandoned the professional cadence and slipped, for just a moment, into something raw and more personal. "I will survive it," Damien said. And there was something in the way he said it, brief and almost startled, that told her he had noticed the shift in her voice as clearly as she had. "Stay focused, Ivy," the west hallway. On the adjacent monitor, Celine had driven the two remaining operators backward into the dead-end maintenance closet. Exactly as Ivy had predicted, their retreat cutting off any path back toward the study, and Ivy watched the confrontation resolve with the same brisk, economical violence Celine had shown in the kitchen corridor minutes earlier, two more silhouettes crumpling to stillness on the grainy feed. She forced her attention back to the monitors, back to the flat, controlled rhythm of dispatch, tracking the final moments of the operation with the same steady focus she had maintained since the first alert chirped through the security system, and it was only when every hostile signature on her bank of screens had gone still that she allowed herself, finally, the smallest exhale of relief. "They're going to hit the study in 20 seconds, Ivy said. "Celine, can you cut them off?" "Not in 20 seconds. Celine's voice came back, strained, still fighting somewhere in the east hallway. "I'm pinned." Ivy's mind raced, scanning every detail of the building's layout she had memorized over 3 days of preparation, every vulnerability and choke point she had mapped out on Celine's blueprints, until something clicked into place with the same sudden, satisfying clarity she felt every time a chaotic call finally resolved into a workable plan. "The study has a secondary lock on the fireplace flue," she said. "It's original to the building. It hasn't been used in decades. But the schematics show it vents into the same shaft as the service elevator. If I trigger the emergency ventilation seal from here, it'll flood that entire section with smoke and cut visibility to nothing. It won't stop them, but it'll slow them down long enough for Damien to get back upstairs." "Do it." Damien's voice cut in, already moving, the sound of impossibly fast footsteps growing louder through the earpiece. Ivy's fingers found the emergency systems panel without hesitation, the same rapid, practiced confidence she brought to every console in every shift of her career, and through the sequence that flooded the study's old fireplace flue with a dense, choking wall of emergency smoke, buying precious seconds in the exact spot where seconds mattered most. It was, in the end, enough. By the time Damien reached the upper floor, moving through the smoke-filled corridor with the effortless, terrible speed of a predator who no longer needed to see his prey to find it, the two remaining breach operators had already begun to falter, coughing and disoriented in the artificial fog. And what followed was brief, and it was decisive. And Ivy, watching the last flicker of movement resolve into stillness on her grainy monitor feed, allowed herself, for the first time in nearly 10 minutes, to breathe. "Clear," Damien's voice came through the earpiece, rough with smoke but steady. "Celine? Who?" "Clear," Celine answered a moment later, breathing hard. "Bruised. Nothing worse." "Ivy," Damien said, and something in the single syllable of her name carried a weight that made her chest tighten. "Status, I'm okay," Ivy said, and heard, this time, that the words carried actual truth behind them, rather than the reflexive lie she had offered on the first terrible night of all this. "I'm okay. Sub-level 2 is Voss." "Alive," Damien said, a grim satisfaction threading through the word. "Restrained. He will answer for tonight, and for whatever else the years since his supposed death have allowed him to build. But not tonight. Not while there is still the matter of the man who hired him to attend to." Ivy felt something cold settle into place beside the adrenaline, still coursing through her system. The understanding, sharp and immediate, that the night was not yet finished. "Marcus," she said. "He will have been running whatever communications he could manage from somewhere close," Damien said. "Voss's people would not have executed a breach without their client monitoring in real time. Find him for me, Ivy. You know him better than any of us." Ivy turned back to the monitors, pulling up the feeds from the building's exterior cameras, scanning the surrounding streets with the same rapid, methodical focus she had brought to every other piece of this unfolding crisis. And it did not take her long to find what she was looking for. A car, parked at an angle just outside the range of the building's primary security perimeter. Engine running. A familiar silhouette visible through the rain-streaked windshield, hunched forward, over what was almost certainly a radio or a phone. "Waiting. Got him," she said. "West side, half a block down. He's alone." There was a pause, and when Damien spoke again, his voice had shifted into something quieter, more deliberate. "I would like your permission before I go to him," he said. And the request, coming from a man who had just dismantled an armed assault team with his bare hands, struck Ivy as almost startlingly formal. "This is your history to close, not mine. If you would rather handle it differently. I will not pretend restraint has ever been my strongest instinct where he is concerned. But I will honor whatever you ask of me tonight." Ivy sat with that for a moment, the offer settling strangely in her chest, and understood, with a clarity that felt like the final piece of a puzzle locking into place, that she did not want Damien to simply erase Marcus from her life the way he had so easily threatened to erase Voss's assault team. She wanted, after 2 years of being silenced and 4 days of being protected, to finish this herself, on her own terms, for the first time. "I want to talk to him," she said. "Just talk. But I want you there, not to hurt him, just so he understands, once and for all, exactly what he's been fighting and exactly why it's already over." "As you wish," Damien said, and there was something in his voice, warm and unmistakably proud, that Ivy carried with her all the way down the stairwell and out into the cold, rain-damp night air. Marcus looked up when the car door was wrenched open, and whatever composure he had managed to hold together through the chaos of the last hour collapsed entirely at the sight of Ivy standing beside Damien Ashworth in the wet glow of a streetlight, unbruised, unbroken, very much alive despite every effort he had funded to ensure otherwise. "This isn't over," Marcus said, though the words came out thin, more reflex than conviction. A cornered animal's last instinct rather than an actual threat. "You think this changes anything?" "I'm still a cop. I still have—" "You have nothing," Ivy said, and her voice, standing there in the rain, carried a steadiness that had nothing left to prove to anyone, least of all herself. "You have 11 complaints on file that are about to become 12. Except this time, I'm not filing it with a colleague who might quietly lose the paperwork. I'm filing it with the FBI's Civil Rights Division, along with a full account of tonight, and a recording of the call I made 4 nights ago that somehow, miraculously, still exists intact on a server neither you nor anyone you hired thought to check." Marcus's face went pale, the calculation behind his eyes visibly collapsing as the shape of his own exposure finally became real to him. "You wouldn't." "I would," Ivy said. "I already have. It went out an hour ago. Time to release regardless of what happens to me tonight, to every reporter and oversight board and internal affairs contact I could find in 4 days of very careful preparation. You spent 2 years teaching me how to survive being afraid, Marcus. Congratulations. You built exactly the woman who was capable of ending you." Damien said nothing throughout the entire exchange, standing a careful step behind her, present but silent. A wall of restrained, patient strength that asked for nothing and offered everything. And it was that silence, more than any threat he could have made, that finally broke whatever remained of Marcus Doyle's resistance. He sat in his car in the rain, staring at the two of them, and Ivy watched, with a satisfaction that felt clean rather than cruel, as 2 years of carefully constructed fear finally, permanently, changed hands. "Go home, Marcus," she said, "and don't come back." He went. She did not sleep again that night. Not really. Adrenaline and relief tangling together into something too restless for rest. And so she was still awake, wrapped in a blanket on the wide couch by the study's dying fire, when Mrs. Alvarez found her just before dawn, carrying 2 mugs of something warm that smelled of honey and dark spice rather than coffee. "Chamomile," Mrs. Alvarez said, settling into the chair across from her without being asked. "With a little something extra to help you actually rest instead of just lying there replaying the whole night in your head." I recognize that look, sweetheart. I wore it myself plenty of times back in my ER days after a bad trauma call finally cleared. Ivy took the mug gratefully, wrapping both hands around its warmth. "Does it get easier," she asked, "watching this world, being part of it, after something like tonight?" "Some of it does," Mrs. Alvarez said, honest in a way Ivy had come to appreciate about her over the last week. "You get used to the strangeness of it, the way you get used to anything given enough time, but the fear when someone you care about is in danger, that part never really gets easier. I don't think it's supposed to. I think that's just what it costs to care about people, mortal or otherwise." She studied Ivy for a long moment, something knowing and gentle in her expression. "He hasn't let anyone this close in longer than I've worked here, 30 years, and I have never once seen him look at anyone the way he looked at you when you walked back through that door tonight." Ivy did not have an answer for that. Not yet. And Mrs. Alvarez, with the particular tact of a woman who had spent decades learning exactly when to leave a silence alone, did not press her for one. They sat together instead, watching the fire burn down to embers as the sky outside slowly lightened from black to gray to the first pale gold of morning. And Ivy found, somewhere in that quiet hour, that the last of her fear had finally, fully drained away, leaving something unfamiliar and cautiously hopeful in its place. The matter of the Vasilev family did not resolve itself quietly, though it resolved itself considerably faster than Ivy had expected. 3 days after the siege, a black car arrived at the base of the tower unannounced, and Damien, reading the make and the plates from the study window with a stillness that told Ivy exactly how seriously he took the visit, informed her, with careful neutrality, that Lord Anton Vasilev himself had come to speak with them. He was an old man, or rather, Ivy corrected herself as he was shown into the study. An old vampire, wearing the careful, distinguished appearance of a man in his 60s, silver-haired and precise in his movements, dressed in a suit that made even Damien's tailoring look almost casual by comparison. He inclined his head toward Damien with the exact, measured courtesy of a rival who respected power even when he resented it, and then turned his attention, sharp and assessing, toward Ivy. "So," Anton Vasilev said, his voice carrying the same cultured, ancient weight Celine's had, though colder, more controlled. "This is the dispatcher who dismantled Aldrich Voss's entire operation from behind a bank of security monitors and then unraveled a decorated police detective's career with nothing more than patience and a well-timed recording. My daughter was quite looking forward to meeting the sovereign's new interest. I confess, I am equally curious myself." "If you've come to threaten her," Damien said, and the temperature in the room dropped by several careful degrees, "I would ask you to reconsider. Anton, I have been remarkably restrained so far in tracing the funding behind Voss's little venture back to its actual source. I would prefer that restraint continue to feel worthwhile to me." "I have not come to threaten anyone," Anton said, holding up one measured hand, though something in his eyes suggested the warning had landed precisely as Damien intended. "I have come, in fact, to extend an apology of sorts, though I suspect the young woman in question will find little comfort in the distinction I am about to draw. My daughter's ambitions toward your throne are her own, Damien, cultivated over decades, and I will not pretend I have not, in my own quieter ways, encouraged them. But financing a mercenary who specializes in the murder of humans connected to this court is considerably further than I am willing to go, or willing to have my family's name associated with, regardless of the outcome it might have produced. Voss acted with funding traced to accounts I have since frozen, and with a level of independent ambition I did not sanction. I have come to tell you both, personally, that whatever hand my family had in setting this in motion, it ends here." Ivy studied him carefully. 4 years of reading strangers' voices for truth beneath panic, serving her now in an entirely different context, and found, beneath the careful diplomatic phrasing, something that read, to her practiced ear, as genuine. Not kindness, not quite, but a calculation that had, for whatever reason, landed on honesty as the more useful path forward. "I don't need an apology," Ivy said. "I need to know your daughter isn't going to try this again in 6 months, once everyone's stopped paying attention." Something flickered across Anton's composed features, surprise perhaps, or a grudging respect, not unlike the shift she had watched cross Celine's face days earlier. "A fair demand," he said. "You have my word. For whatever currency that carries with a stranger, my daughter's ambitions will find another avenue, or they will not. But they will not, again, involve hired mercenaries and human ex-boyfriends with grudges to exploit. That much I promise you both, personally." He left as precisely as he had arrived, and Damien watched the black car pull away from the base of the tower, with an expression that mingled wariness and cautious relief in equal measure. "Do you believe him?" Ivy asked. "I believe he values his own family's standing considerably more than he values his daughter's ambition toward my throne," Damien said. "Which is not quite the same as trust. But it is, in the particular currency of this court, close enough to peace that I'm willing to accept it for now." He turned to look at her, something softening in his expression. "You handled that with considerably more composure than most mortals manage on their first encounter with a lord of Anton Vasilev's standing. I've talked down worse over a phone line," Ivy said, and found, when she said it, that it was entirely true, and that the truth of it had stopped feeling strange to her sometime over the last difficult, transformative week. The days that followed unfolded with a strange, quiet gentleness that Ivy had not expected, after everything, to find waiting for her on the other side of the storm. Voss and the surviving members of his breach team were handed over, Damien explained, to a tribunal within the hidden hierarchy of his own kind, a court far older and considerably less forgiving than anything the human justice system could offer. Ivy did not witness the proceedings herself, and Damien did not press her to, but he told her. Several nights later, sitting by the fire with a glass of the dark wine, his household kept for guests who could not stomach anything closer to what sustained him, that Voss's tribunal had lasted less than an hour, and that the ancient laws governing his kind treated the deliberate hunting of humans connected to the court as among the gravest offenses a vampire could commit, regardless of how thoroughly he had once faked his own death to escape a lesser reckoning. "He will not trouble this city again," Damien said simply, and something in the careful, controlled way he said it told Ivy that the details of what had actually transpired were not details he intended to share with her, and that she did not, in the end, particularly want him to. Whatever the Vasilev family's involvement had actually been beyond Anton's visit, it was, in the weeks that followed, quietly and thoroughly addressed through channels Ivy was not invited to witness directly, though Celine's satisfied, knowing smile whenever the subject arose, told her everything she needed to know about how completely that particular threat had been dismantled. Marcus Doyle resigned from the Chicago Police Department 11 days later. Under circumstances the department's official statement described only as a mutual decision following an internal review. Ivy read the announcement on her phone, sitting on the wide stone balcony of the penthouse with the lake spread out gold and glittering below her in the late afternoon sun, and felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, the last knot of fear in her chest finally, fully release. It was Damien who found her there an hour later, settling into the chair beside her with the same unhurried, careful grace that had marked every one of his movements since the night he had stepped through her broken doorway. "You are quiet," he said. "I'm thinking," Ivy said, "about the letter. About Margaret Calloway, sitting at some switchboard 80 years ago, wondering if the strangeness of her own life meant something, and never getting an answer." She turned to look at him, the late sun catching the sharp lines of his face, softening them into something almost unbearably gentle. I think I finally understand what she was trying to say. It's not that our voices are special because some old bargain marked our blood. It's that we spent our whole lives learning how to hold other people together in their worst moments. And somewhere along the way, that becomes its own kind of power, whether anyone ever explains it to us or not. I think that is likely closer to the truth than any old letter could capture, Damien said quietly. Though I confess I am no longer entirely certain the two explanations are as separate as you are suggesting. Perhaps the blood and the choice were never meant to be understood apart from one another. They sat together in the fading gold light for a long while, the city settling into evening below them, and it was Ivy, finally, who broke the comfortable silence stretching between them. "What happens now?" she asked. "I can't exactly go back to my old apartment. I can't exactly go back to my old life. Not after everything I've seen, but I also don't know what it means to just stay here, be here, with you, with all of this." Damien considered the question with the same careful gravity he brought to everything that mattered to him, and when he finally answered, his voice carried none of the formal distance he had maintained in their earliest conversations. Only something warmer, more honest, more entirely undone. "I do not know how to explain. In any language, I have learned, across 4.5 centuries, what it meant to hear your voice on a line that had gone silent for 11 years, and to understand, in the space of a single terrible sentence, that I would tear apart anything standing between myself and reaching you in time," he said. "I have ruled this city's shadows for 2 centuries, Ivy, and I have done so, if I am honest, in a kind of exhausted, dutiful solitude. I stopped questioning long ago. I am not asking you to become anything you do not choose to become. I am asking only if you would allow me the chance to learn what it might mean to no longer carry that solitude alone." Ivy looked at him for a long moment, the last of the sunlight fading gold across the surface of the lake, and thought of every call she had ever taken, every stranger she had talked through the worst 30 seconds of their life, without ever once being asked, in return, whether anyone had been holding steady for her. "I'd like that," she said. "Not as some rescued girl you're keeping safe out of guilt or destiny or an old letter neither of us fully understands. As an equal, as someone who chose this, with her eyes open, because it's what she actually wants." "As an equal," Damien agreed. Something in his voice, breaking open with a warmth 4 centuries, had not managed to extinguish, "is precisely how I have wanted you to stand beside me from the very first moment I heard your voice on that line." He reached for her hand, and this time, when their fingers laced together in the fading light, there was no hesitation left in either of them, only the quiet, hard-won certainty of 2 people who had each spent their entire existence learning how to be strong for everyone else, finally allowing themselves the rare, unfamiliar luxury of being strong for one another. Instead, Celine found them there an hour later, the last light gone from the sky, and if her expression carried a trace of her old, cold amusement as she took in the sight of the 2 of them sitting together in comfortable silence, it carried, underneath it, something that looked remarkably like genuine approval. "The court is already talking," she said, "about the human woman who survived Voss's people, who mapped out her own defense, who dismantled a police detective's entire life, with nothing but a well-timed recording and a spine of pure iron. "I told you the letter was onto something, dispatcher. I did not expect to be quite this right. I'm still not planning on becoming anyone's queen," Ivy said, though there was no real heat behind it, only a warmth that had grown over the last week into something closer to genuine friendship. "I like my job. I like answering calls. I don't think that part of me is going anywhere, no matter what old letters say about my blood." "Good," Celine said, with a small, unexpected smile. "This city could use a few more voices like yours, answering when the world calls for help. Even if, apparently, it now occasionally calls somewhere considerably stranger than the switchboard." Ivy laughed, the sound easy and unguarded in a way it had not been in longer than she could remember, and looked out at the city stretching glittering below them, at every hidden window where some other frightened stranger might, on any given night, be reaching for a phone and hoping desperately for someone, anyone, to answer. She went back to work the following month, at her own insistence, over the quiet, unspoken worry of a household that had grown, in a matter of weeks, fiercely protective of her. Her supervisor, a tired, kind woman named Deborah, who had covered for Ivy's absence without asking too many questions, simply hugged her tightly on her first night back and told her the console had not felt right without her voice on it. Her co-workers noticed. In the vague, half-curious way co-workers notice anything, that something about Ivy seemed different, steadier somehow, though none of them could quite have said what had changed, and Ivy found, settling back into the familiar rhythm of her headset and her console and the low hum of the dispatch floor, that she did not particularly want to explain it to them either. Some things she had learned over one impossible, transformative month were meant to be carried quietly, known only by the people who had actually stood beside her in the dark. She sat once again behind her console in the quiet hum of the dispatch center, her voice as calm and steady as it had ever been, guiding frightened strangers through the worst 30 seconds of their lives, one call at a time. But she carried something new into that chair now, something Margaret Calloway had tried and failed to fully name 80 years earlier, in a letter sealed with old wax and older hope. The quiet, unshakable knowledge that somewhere in this city, in a tower of dark glass and older stone, someone was finally, always, listening for her voice in return. Late one night, near the end of a long shift, a call came through that reminded her, with a clarity that stopped her breath for a moment, of exactly how far she had traveled since the storm that had changed everything. A young woman, barely 20, whispering from a locked bathroom while a man's fists split the wood of a door somewhere behind her. And Ivy, steady and calm and utterly present, in a way that 4 years of training had built and one impossible month had deepened into something else entirely, talked her through it, minute by minute, until the sirens finally arrived and the door held long enough for help to reach her. When the call ended, Ivy sat for a moment with her headset still on, thinking of Harper and of every other frightened voice she would never know the full ending of, and found herself hoping, quietly and fiercely, that somewhere out there, for every one of them, some version of the impossible arrived in time. She thought, too, of Damien, waiting for her at home, in the tower of dark glass and old stone, of the particular, hard-won peace of finally being loved by someone who understood exactly what it cost to hold other people's fear so that they did not have to carry it alone. She had called for help once, on the worst night of her life, and the world had sent her something she never could have imagined asking for. Not rescue, in the end, though there had certainly been plenty of that. Something better, something that had taken her own hard-won strength, and finally, for the first time, given it somewhere safe to rest. She drove home through the quiet, sleeping city as dawn broke gray and gold over the lake. And somewhere above her, in a window that never quite went dark, someone was waiting, who had once answered a call that should never have reached him at all, and had never once, since that night, stopped being grateful that it had. If you loved this story of a dispatcher who found her own rescue answered by a king out of the shadows, hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs a little dark romance in their life, and subscribe for more spine-chilling tales of forbidden love and impossible rescue. Drop a comment below and let us know if your own call for help was answered by something out of the shadows. Would you have run, or would you have stayed? Would you have trusted the voice on the other end of the line, or hung up and bolted the door instead? We will see you in the next story.